I was late for work, so late that I knew there was no point even leaving the house. I might as well stay slumped on the sofa watching TV and working my way through the last of the potato chips. In a while, I would clean myself in the front room up. I had time before my parents got back from their jobs. It wouldn't be the first time that I had vacuumed crumbs off myself and the sofa and the floor. Not the first time either that I had missed work. I was 21, I still lived at home and worked as an assistant janitor. The worst consequence of me not turning up to work again was that I would be fired, and after that my parents would eventually kick me out. I wouldn't blame work for letting me go. I wouldn't blame my parents for having had enough of me either. I was a total loser. I knew this as well as anyone. I guess my only redeeming feature was that I wasn't kidding myself. I had never claimed to be an aspiring screenwriter or musician or an actor. Nope, not me. I was a waster, pure and simple. I sighed and shoveled the final crunchy chips into my mouth. I couldn't remember what had happened so far in the old movies showing on the TV, and I didn't care what happened next, so I got up off the sofa. I felt dizzy for a moment after being slumped there for hours, and then I went into the kitchen to see what else there was to eat. The kitchen was all snacked out though, and it was later than I had realized. The clock on the wall was ticking towards the time when my parents would be home. I didn't get my act into gear. I never got my act into gear, but I did start cleaning up. I vacuumed and then put a bunch of empty packs and wrappers in the kitchen bin. Well, I tried to anyway. The bin was full to the brim and I'd already compacted the trash down as much as I could with the sole of my shoe. There was no alternative. I needed to empty the bin and take the trash out. I sort of managed to tie the bag up and carried it out into the backyard. There was no sign of the neighbors outside, thankfully. Mr. and Mrs. Taylor had lived next door forever. They hated me. This was with some justification. I had to admit after pranks that I had played on them when I was a kid. I hadn't done anything in years, but they were not the forgetting and forgiving type. Every time that they saw me, they gave me filthy looks, and more than once they had called the cops on me for no good reason. Best avoided was my approach to Mr. and Mrs. Taylor. And it looked like I wouldn't have to put up with their glares, this time at least, as I moved over to the trash can and lowered the bag into it. And then to my dismay, an empty wrapper fell from the bag and a gust of wind carried it over into their backyard. I could have just left it there. Maybe should have left it there. But I knew that Mr. Taylor would find it and wait until my parents were home, and then hammer on the door in rage about the littering and how he knew exactly who was responsible. Yours truly. I sighed and checked the coast was clear and then sneaked over into Mr. and Mrs. Taylor's backyard to retrieve the offending item. All I really wanted was an easy life. The easier the better, with no shouting or hard work, or any kind of work ideally. I moved as quietly as I could across their backyard and was an inch from the wrapper when I realized that I was busted. Mrs. Taylor was standing at the window. She was looking out in my direction. This was more than littering now. It was trespassing as well. My shoulders slumped. I smiled at her anyway, trying to be friendly, and I lifted up the wrapper and pointed back to my trash can, letting her see that I was tidying up. I knew she wouldn't see it that way. I knew that Mr. Taylor wouldn't either when she told him what that no-good punk from next door had done now. But I had to try. I widened my attempt at a friendly grin and then noticed that Mrs. Taylor appeared weird. Her eyes were like totally glazed over, and there was dribble running down her chin as well. I wondered if she was ill. A part of me wanted to go up to the window and ask if she was all right. Sure, I was a loser, but I hoped that I wasn't a totally bad person. I was still considering if this was the right thing to do when I heard the sound of somebody clearing their throat behind me. I forgot all about being helpful. My guts tightened. I turned around. Mr. Taylor was standing there. He was in his 60s. He was skinny as a rake with a few wispy strands of hair left on his liver-spotted head. He cleared his throat again, only it didn't sound like he was trying to attract my attention. I mean, why should he? He had my attention. He had my wide-eyed wishing that I was anywhere but here attention. The sound that was coming from his throat actually sounded more like he was having problems breathing. It was a harsh and bubbling sound, and his eyes were all wrong as well. They were glazed over like his wife's, and there was dribble on his chin, saliva around the corners of his mouth. There were bubbles popping in the saliva. I suddenly started to feel very cold. There was something wrong with Mr. Taylor, something very wrong. I wanted to get away from him, but all the strength had drained from my legs. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to disturb you." His mouth opened as he was going to respond, but he said nothing. For my part, I just stared at him. I didn't think that I had ever seen him smile, but I had seen him grimace, and I didn't recall his teeth being anything other than regular off-white. They were dark now and cracked. There was a chunk of something caught in a gap between two of his upper teeth as well. It looked like a small piece of meat. Pink meat with a streak of blood running through it. From somewhere I found the strength to start backing away towards my backyard. One of Mr. Taylor's legs twitched and inched forwards. His other leg did the same. His feet dragged along the ground as he moved. He was following me, shuffling along slowly and unnaturally. "I'm sorry," I said again, hearing the fear in my voice. "I'm sorry for everything." And then I turned tail and scampered. I slammed the kitchen door behind me and bolted it. I drew the blind and stood there trying to calm down. After a couple of minutes, I moved the blind an inch so that I could peek out. After a couple of minutes, I moved the blind an inch so that I could peek out and check that everything was okay again. But Mr. Taylor was standing right outside the door. He wasn't moving, he didn't even seem to be breathing. Beyond him, his wife was standing in the window of their house, gazing blankly out. I pushed the blinds back into place and went into the front room, sat on the sofa, and I stared at the TV. I clicked through the channels to try and forget about Mr. and Mrs. Taylor. I reached a news channel. There was something going on about a chemical spill, local residents being advised to stay indoors. The newsreader announcing this looked bored. The local government official that they cut to for an interview looked like he talked about this kind of thing every day. "There was nothing to worry about," he was saying. "Well, that's fine for you to say," I thought. I wrapped my arms around my stomach and gave myself a hug. A car pulled up outside. I couldn't see the driveway from where I was sitting, but I knew that it would be my dad. He always arrived home first after a day at the office where he worked as an accountant. My mom would be right on his heels. She was a dental technician, and though she finished work earlier than my dad, she always did some retail therapy before making her way back home. I got up off the sofa and went to look out the front window. My dad was a careful driver and always parked ruler straight, leaving room for Mom in the driveway. And then he would climb out and make sure that his tie was straight as well before beeping the car lock. He was a man of precise habits. But this afternoon his car was at an angle. Its back end was sticking out to the right, and there was no way that Mom could have parked in the driveway. And my dad had not gotten out of the car. He just sat behind the steering wheel. He still had his seatbelt on. For a moment I wondered if he had been drinking. But my dad was the last person on earth to have done something as stupid and dangerous as driving under the influence. I wondered if perhaps he had had a bad day at work. Maybe he had even been laid off. I took a deep breath and went outside to ask him what was wrong. As I approached the car, I could see my dad was not moving, and he had that same glazed over look as Mr. and Mrs. Taylor. Not that I cared about them anymore. This was my dad. We had had a lot of blazing arguments when I was a teenager, and I will admit that there were times that I had hated his guts. But seeing him like this, it tore me apart. I reached the driver's door and I hesitated. My dad was turning his head. He had noticed me, but there was no smile, no friendly wave. He started to struggle against the seatbelt instead. He rocked back and forwards, moving more and more violently. It would have been easy for him to release the seatbelt like he had done countless times before, but it was as if he didn't understand how to do that anymore. As he fought to free himself, saliva frothed between his lips and he began to snarl. It was a sickening sound. My dad sounded more like a wild animal than a human, more like a monster than a middle-aged accountant. I didn't think the driver's door would have been locked. I could have opened it and let my dad out of the seatbelt, but I was too scared. I was too scared of him. Without really thinking about it, I took a couple of steps backwards. I needed someone to help me. I suppose if I had been thinking straight, I could have gone back into the house and dialed 911, but my mind was clouded by confusion and fear. I looked up and down the street. There was no one in sight, but there was a car parked in the driveway of the house directly across the road. It belonged to Mrs. Watson. She was a nurse and she worked shifts at the local hospital, and it looked like she was in. Desperately needing that to be the case, I ran over to knock on her front door. As I raised my hand, I noticed that the door was ajar. I knocked anyway. There was no answer. I called out, "Hello, Mrs. Watson." There was still nothing, and so I pushed the door all the way open and stepped into the hallway. There was a body lying on the floor at the end of the hallway. Mrs. Watson had her back to me and was leaning over the body. She was helping whoever it was, I figured. I knew that I shouldn't get in the way, but I could not hold back. "Mrs. Watson," I said, "I'm sorry, but my dad needs your help as well. It's urgent, he's—" I did not finish. Mrs. Watson had looked up at the sound of my voice. Her mouth was ringed with blood. Blood dripped from her chin. There was a pink, blood-stained strip of something in her mouth. She was chewing it as she stared in my direction. Her eyes were glazed. She blinked, chewed, turned back to the body on the ground. I could tell now that it was her husband. The flesh of his left cheek had been torn away. Mrs. Watson leaned in close and bit her husband's nose. She clamped onto it with her teeth and began to shake her head from side to side like an animal as she tried to rip the nose away. I backed away. I stepped through her front door and was still walking backwards when I reached the sidewalk. I turned in a circle and found myself facing my dad's car again. I headed back over to him. He was still held in place by his seatbelt. He was smashing his head against the side window in manic frustration. The inside of the glass was smeared with his blood. I said, "Please, Dad, don't." I felt helpless and afraid. I felt lost. And behind me, I heard the sound of snarling. I looked over my shoulder. Mrs. Watson had emerged from her front door. Her face was still decorated with blood. Her husband was standing alongside her. His cheek was still missing. His nose was now gone, and there was a dark cavity in its place. They both looked in my direction and then started to move towards me in the same unnatural way that Mr. Taylor had done. Mr. and Mrs. Watson were not moving very fast, and I knew that I could outrun them. I started to run down the street. I felt bad about leaving my dad behind, but I didn't know what I could do other than keep looking for help. I ran past houses that all looked the same. There were people standing in the windows and driveways of some. Their eyes were glazed over and their heads turned slowly as I staggered past. The sound of snarling drifted down the street as I tried to increase my pace. I hadn't run anywhere since I had been forced to do athletics at high school, and I was massively unfit. By the time I reached the town's mall, I had a sharp pain in my chest. I paused and put my hands on my knees and tried to catch my breath. The mall was small scale. There were 20 outlets spread over 2 floors. The car park out front had space for 250 vehicles. There were 24 or so cars parked up. I spotted my mom's car and, feeling boosted that she was there, I hurried towards the mall's entrance. The doors slid open and I stepped inside. There were new widescreen TVs displayed in the first shop window that I saw. One of them was showing the news. I couldn't hear the sound, but I could see the tape running across the bottom of the screen. It read, "Authorities advising against traveling into or out of the area affected by chemical spill." I shivered and moved on. The lights were on in all the outlets on the lower level. They seemed to be open. But where were the shoppers and where was the staff? There was no one in sight. And then I glanced through the window of a coffee shop and saw that there was someone inside. They were slumped over a table and not moving. A laptop was still open in front of them. A mug of coffee had been spilled over the keyboard. In the bookstore opposite, I saw the upper half of a man who was sprawled on the floor. There was a sprawling line of blood leading up to one of his fingers, as if he had been trying to write something. Next to the bookstore, there was a clothes store. Mannequins made up their window display. They were draped in low-priced summer dresses, hats, shorts, polo shirts, and pastel colors. Apart from one figure, he wore a baseball cap, t-shirt, and jeans. His mouth was open and his eyes were glazed. His hand shot forward suddenly and slapped against the glass. His open palm pressed against it and then slipped down, leaving a smear of blood on the window. I took a step backwards. Whatever had happened to my neighbors and my dad had happened here. I tried to push away the sickening thought that the same thing would have happened to my mom. I swallowed. My mouth was very dry and I was aware of my pulse beating too fast and too hard. I looked around for my mom and had the sudden chilling feeling that I was being watched. I glanced up and saw that there were figures standing on the upper level. They were lined up and staring down towards me. Blood stained their faces and clothes. My mom was up there. She was expressionless, silent and still. And I knew that she wasn't my mom anymore. She was one of them. Her blood-darkened lips curled. She raised her arm slowly and pointed at me. The line of grotesque figures began to shuffle towards the top of the escalator. It was a bizarre procession. They were clumsy, these monsters, and when they collided, they snarled and clawed at each other. The first of them reached the top of the escalator and began to descend it. A crush soon developed at the pressure point where they were trying to join the elevator and one of them fell. It toppled to the floor a dozen feet from where I stood. There was a sickening thud as it landed. It lay there in a pool of its own spilled blood. Its limbs were twisted under it and its head hung limply to one side. I thought that I was done for. But as I watched on in horror, it tried to get up. But too many of its bones must have been shattered and it could not. But it did not give up. It began to crawl towards me, dragging itself forward on its hideously damaged arms and legs. Its head was raised. Its terrible gaze was directed at me. As it moved, it left a trail of blood in its wake. The first of those to have reached the base of the escalator were shuffling through this blood now. They were all heading for me. The thing that had been my mom was in their midst, and it was snarling and clawing at the air. The things from the stores and the coffee shop were emerging as well, shuffling my way. I stumbled away from them all. The mall doors opened automatically and I was back outside. I could hear screams in the distance. I guessed there were others like me who had not changed. From their agonized cries, I could only assume that they had been caught. They were being overwhelmed, they were being devoured. The screaming stopped. Tears began to run down my face, but I couldn't break down. There was a stream of horrific figures shuffling out from the mall. More of them were making their way down the road. I ran. There were derelict lots ahead of me. One building remained. It was the public library. The library dated from the 1920s. It was one of the oldest buildings in town. Now that everybody consumed content online, the library was going to be shut down to save money. There was already a sign on its doors saying that it was closed to the public, but the doors were propped open by wooden blocks and there was a car parked close by. I peered at the windows of the library and could see movements inside. I could only hope against hope that it was not the Changed, as I had sprinted towards the doors and then hurried inside. The doors led straight into the main space of the library. There was a counter area, acres of shelves and wooden tables and chairs where people used to sit and read. A lot of the shelves were empty. Two women were taking books that remained and piling them onto trolleys. I recognized one of them as the librarian. The other was a girl that I had been to school with. Her name was Sarah and I had a huge crush on her. I had never stood a chance of ever going out with her. She was clever and driven and breathtakingly beautiful. Right then though, she was looking at me with a surprised expression on her face, as I stood there breathing heavily with my face streaked with tears. The librarian was looking puzzled as well. My first reaction was relief that they were not the Changed. My second was to turn around, kick the props away, pull the doors closed and slide a large bolt into place to secure them. And then I grabbed one of the trolleys and pushed it side on against the doors as a barricade. "What on earth are you doing?" the librarian asked. "We have to keep them out." The librarian looked as if she had no idea what I was talking about. "Them," I said and pointed towards the door. "Everyone is changed. They're monsters. They're covered in blood and they're eating people. If you don't believe me, look at your phone. There has to be stories about it now." The librarian replied, "All I know is that Sarah was helping me pack up the books before we closed the library, but I will look at the news if that will help you calm down." After a moment studying her screen, she said, "There's a report saying that troops are being deployed to ensure the safety of local people and businesses following a chemical spill in the area. But that's it. There's nothing about monsters." I wanted to scream with frustration. "It's a cover-up," I said. "Nonsense," the librarian said and then looked back at her screen and frowned. Sarah was looking at her phone and frowning as well. "Internet connection's down," she said. She tapped her phone and her frown got deeper before she said, "I can't get through to my mom." She looked up at me like maybe I was talking nonsense and asked, "Do you really think we're in danger?" I did not have the chance to answer. The sound of the doors being struck echoed through the library. It was the Changed. I pictured them crowded around the doors, and they would not give up. They would keep pushing and hitting and kicking and scratching at the doors until they got in. Sarah and the librarian both looked frozen with fear. I was terrified as well, but I was rolling with the shocks and said to them, "Help me get more things pushed against the doors." I pushed a second trolley loaded with books by myself, and Sarah helped me with another. The librarian hadn't moved. She was staring at the doors and flinching at the sounds of them being hit. I could hear the terror in her voice when she said, "They're going to get in and attack us." I wanted to tell her that everything was going to be all right, but that would have been a lie. The doors were going to give way soon under the assault of the Changed. They were at the windows as well now, scraping at the glass with their nails and pressing their faces against it. And then they started to smash their fists and their foreheads against the glass. Cracks began to appear. They were lined with blood from the self-inflicted wounds of the Changed. I turned to the librarian and said, "Is there another way out?" "The fire escape. But it's jammed and nobody's tried to fix it because there's no point with the library closing. We'll kick it through, I said with grim determination. Show me the way. She headed past the counter and into a small back room where an old PC was stacked on the floor alongside packs of stationery. Sarah and I followed her through the back room and along a corridor that led to the fire door. It was opened by a metal bar. I ran up to the bar and tried to push it down to open the door. As the librarian had warned, it was stuck solid. I wasn't worried about fire or smoke. Fear was racing through my body because I could hear glass shattering and wood cracking, and the guttural voices of the Changed growing louder. They were inside the library, and they were coming closer, unnatural step by unnatural step. I slammed both my hands down onto the bar to try again to move it, but there was no give. I looked over my shoulder at Sarah and said, "Help me." She moved to my side and we pushed down with all our strength at the same time. The bar moved and we pushed the fire door open. The fresh air that drifted through felt so good. I turned to the librarian and said, "Come on, we can get out of here now." But she did not seem to have heard me. She was standing with her arms hanging by her side and her head was down. There was a stillness about her that filled me with dread. And then she slowly lifted her head. Her hair hung limply around her face and the spark had gone out of her eyes. They were dull and glazed. Her mouth opened, her teeth were rotting stumps. I turned away. She was one of them now. Sarah was staring at the librarian and hyperventilating. I linked arms with Sarah and said, "We have to go now." I fought back the urge to run, and as I gently led her outside, by the time the Changed emerged a minute later, the librarian had been subsumed into the mass of shuffling fiends. Sarah and I kept moving. I could hear the sound of helicopters in the distance, but I couldn't see any when I glanced up. And then Sarah took my hand. I looked at her and she said, "I live close by, we can go there." I didn't know if we would be safe, but I couldn't think of anything better, so I nodded and said, "Yeah, sounds good." She actually smiled when I said this, and despite everything else that was happening, the way that I used to feel about her had resurfaced. I was that teenager again. And now it was Sarah leading me as we headed down a residential street. Trash cans were overturned, windows were smashed, doors hung open, but there was no sign of any of the Changed. We took a shortcut over a lawn and reached a front door that was still closed. Sarah let go of my hand, took out a key and let us in. The house was cool and dark. There was a faint floral smell. A small circular mirror hung on the wall in the hallway next to a framed photograph of Sarah and her mom. I had the unwanted vision of Sarah's mom moving through the streets of our hometown, with the other Changed as they searched for human flesh to devour. I was still seeing this in my mind's eye when Sarah said, "Let's go upstairs." I followed her as she took the stairs two at a time. We went past a bathroom and what looked like a home office. There was a bedroom on our left and we went in there. Sarah pushed the door closed behind us. From the clothes lying about, I realized that this must be Sarah's bedroom. She moved over to a chest of drawers and started to drag it towards the door. I stopped gawping and helped her. Once the chest of drawers was in place, Sarah sat in a corner of the room and asked me to sit next to her. "I'm scared," she said. "Yeah, me too," I replied. She rested her head on my shoulder and said in a quiet voice, "Don't leave me." "I won't," I whispered back, but I am not sure if she heard me because she had fallen asleep. She felt very warm against me as sleep overtook me as well. My eyes closed and I drifted off. The next thing I knew, I was waking up with a start. There was a loud clattering noise that seemed to be filling the room. I blinked and looked around and realized the noise was a helicopter that must have been passing directly over Sarah's house. We were still alone in our bedroom. Through the window I could see that it had gone dark outside. Sarah hadn't moved. She was still curled up alongside me and her head rested on my shoulder. She was no longer warm though. She was cold, so cold. She moved and began to lift her head, and she turned to face me. My high school crush, who I still adored. We were close enough to kiss. Her lips parted and she moved closer. It should have been a dream come true, but it was a waking nightmare. Her breath, it stank of decay. Her mouth opened and her teeth were repulsive. They were dark and cracked like ancient tombstones. The thing that had been Sarah lurched forwards to bite me. I rolled away, pushed it off of me, and clambered towards the door on all fours. It was getting to its feet. It was snarling and its fingers were clawing at the air. I got up and managed to drag the chest of drawers far enough for me to open the door and squeeze through. And then I was running back downstairs and out onto the path. Searchlights from helicopters crisscrossed the streets and a distorted amplified voice announced, "This area is under military control." A searchlight cut through the darkness of the street ahead of me, and I saw a group of the Changed. They looked up into the light and clawed at it with their hands, as if it was something solid that they could touch. And then the searchlight momentarily caught me in its glare as it swept forwards. The Changed saw me and began to shuffle towards me. A snarl behind me made me turn away from them for a second. It was the thing that had been Sarah. It had almost caught up with me. "I'll call you in the morning," I told it, stifled a hysterical laugh, and then began to run down the road. I knew that I wouldn't get far before encountering more of the Changed, but I had a new hope now. The military would save me. A helicopter was flying over a nearby line of rooftops. I jumped up and down and waved my arms in its direction to attract the crew's attention. "Here," I shouted, "I'm not one of them." My shouts alerted another dozen-strong group of the Changed to my presence. They began to shuffle towards me, the hunger clear on their hideous faces. Well, that didn't matter, because the helicopter crew must have heard me as well. The helicopter was hovering. "Yes," I yelled. And seconds later, the bullets began to fly. I felt them screaming through the air a few feet to my side, and I saw the bodies of the Changed being ripped apart. The helicopter stopped firing as it passed over them, and then it swung back in an arc. It was low enough for me to see the soldier manning the weapon. I saw him swivel it and begin to aim it. I realized with horror that he was aiming it at me now. He must have thought that I was one of them. I threw myself to the side and rolled behind a parked car just in time. The car shook as it was hit. I glanced up. The helicopter was flying straight on, picking out a new cluster of the Changed with its searchlight, and then opening fire on them. I gulped in the air, tasted cordite from the volley that had almost ended my life. So much for getting help, I thought. The authorities were clearly set on mass destruction, and I was going to end up as collateral damage. Unless the Changed got to me first. Talk about stuck between a rock and a hard place. I muttered bitterly to myself and began to make my way along the road in a desperate search of sanctuary. I reached the ravaged remains of the Changed that had just been cut down. It was an awful sight. Like a medieval tableau of Hades laid out in blood, flesh and bone on the streets of my hometown. I was transfixed until I heard the blades of a new helicopter that were approaching. Its searchlight was about to expose me. I would be dead in moments unless I found somewhere to hide. But there was nothing else for it. I lay down in the middle of these slaughtered bodies of the Changed. The stench was nauseating. The feel of slimy flesh against my skin, it repulsed me. I swallowed down bile, closed my eyes so I couldn't see the glistening darkness that lay exposed all around me, and I waited for the helicopter to pass over. I could hear the clump of its blades and feel the air move under their touch. Not much longer, I told myself, and I lay as still as I could. Something crawled onto my face. A bug, I figured. I tried to ignore it as it crawled across my cheek. I fought against the urge to brush it away as it reached my lips and as the helicopter grew quieter. Long seconds later, it was a dull sound in the near distance. I opened my eyes and swept the bug off my face with my fingers. It was a beetle. Its dark shell seemed to glint in the night as it scurried over the butchered corpse next to me. And I saw that it was not the only bug that had been drawn to the bodies. A swarm of flies filled the air above me. There was no way that I could get up without having to pass through the flies. I put my hand over my mouth and nostrils and got to my feet. I felt dizzy and sick, and my clothes were wet with the viscous liquids that had seeped from the bodies and transferred onto me when I had lain among them. There was nothing that I could do about that, though. I still had to find a hiding place. I hurried down an alley that took me into a weed and litter-strewn patch of ground. There was a sign saying no trespassers planted in the ground, and beyond that, a ramshackle wooden house. I knew who lived there, but I had never met him. Matt James was a decorated Army veteran who liked to keep to himself most of the time. In normal circumstances, I would have kept on respecting that. But this was the polar opposite of normal, so I hurried towards his house. As I came closer, I saw that there was somebody sitting just inside the house. The door was open, so I walked up to it and peered inside. James was in an armchair and armed. He was pointing both barrels at me. From his reputation, I knew that James was a man who would not hesitate to fire. I held up my hands to show him that I meant no harm, but I wasn't sure that that would help. I was basically a stranger who had turned up on his doorstep uninvited while the world was going to pieces, and I was smeared with blood and worse. The weapon was steady in his grip as he narrowed his eyes and studied me, and then he said in a gravelly but very calm voice, "You smell like a zombie, and you look like a zombie, but you still got life in your eyes." He lowered the barrels and grinned at me before adding, "Which means that you're not one of them." I almost collapsed with relief and said shakily, "No, sir, I'm not one of the changed. Not a zombie." "Well," he said, "in that case, you're welcome to come in. The old place is not much to look at, but it's still standing, and I have a bunker hidden in the basement for eventualities such as this. Ever since my army days when I witnessed some very dubious secret projects, I've been expecting an outbreak of the living dead. Most folks around here would have described that as crazy talk, but most folks around here now seem to have become the living dead themselves. So it seems that I was right in my opinions and they were wrong." He paused long enough to spit on the floor and then continued, "Now, it is happening though, and I've decided that I don't want to hide in no bunker. I want to go out in one last blaze of glory." I admired him for his fighting spirit, but I did not share it with him. I don't want to die. There are so many things that I haven't done yet. My voice started to break and I couldn't go on. I wouldn't have been surprised if he had laughed at me and told me to grow a spine, but his bloodshot eyes showed understanding. "I hear you, boy. You go through into the kitchen and find the floorboard with a knot in its center. Press down on that as hard as you can and it will lift up. That's the entrance into the bunker. You'll find enough food and water and all the other basics to survive down there for months." I knew there was no point trying to persuade him to change his mind and hide from the changed as well, so I told him that I was mighty grateful and went through to the kitchen. I found the floorboard and I opened it without a problem. The gap was just wide enough for me to squeeze through, and I found myself in a walled-off space. There was a light switch to my left. I clicked it on and pulled the floorboard back into place. There were cans and bottles of water piled against one wall, and a toilet in one corner. A chair completed the sparse setup. I was too tense to sit down, but I managed not to pace up and down in case I made a sound. And so I stood there, listening and waiting. After a few minutes, I began to worry that the light might be visible through any gaps in the floorboards above. I turned it off and I continued my vigil in the dark. I could hear nothing at first, but then I heard snarling. It was muffled initially, but grew steadily louder. There must have been a mob of the changed shuffling towards the house, and they would not need to break in. The door was open. The snarls rose again in volume. The changed sounded as if they were in a frenzy. They must have seen James by now sitting in his armchair. They would be ravenous, driven forward by their need for flesh. I did not know if they would comprehend what was about to happen, and even though I was expecting it, I flinched at the sound of a weapon being discharged. I didn't know how many of the changed James had been able to take out before they made it to him, but he had gone out in his blaze of glory. I was left listening to the voices of the changed and their footsteps as they shuffled into the kitchen. They walked back and forwards just above my head. There must have been dozens of them crowded into the room. I stood there. I was terrified that they would hear me breathing. I was terrified that they would be able to smell me. I dared not move in case the ground creaked below my feet. Time seemed to have stopped. I was trapped and waiting for them to discover me. They would rip up the floorboards and descend upon me. They would claw and bite me and begin to tear my flesh from my bone. I would scream in agony, but there would be no mercy because the changed knew only hunger and I was their meal. These thoughts possessed me as the changed shuffled and snarled. They were getting even louder, I realized, and moving more quickly. They do know that I'm here, I thought with sickening certainty, and then the world above was thrown into chaos. An ear-splitting explosion was followed by intense bursts of fire. I threw myself to the ground and covered my head with my hands as the sounds of the attack raged on. The bunker was shaking and dust was cascading down from the floorboards, but there were no bullets breaking through. A few hideous minutes after it had begun, the attack had ceased. A voice called out, "Hostiles eliminated, all clear." There were the sounds of boots stomping and conversations that I couldn't make out. I could hear things being dragged across the floor. And then silence descended. I stayed on the ground. I could feel the dust that had fallen lying on my skin, and then something dripped down onto my scalp. I touched my hair and looked at my fingers, and they were sticky with blood. I glanced up towards the ceiling. The blood of the change that had been illuminated by the military was seeping through. I still could not move. Some of the changed could still be up there, and the military definitely was. They would take me out without hesitation. I curled up into a ball and lay there as blood fell onto me and the silence stretched out. I do not know exactly how long I stayed like that. Hours must have passed before I crawled over to get a bottle of water. I felt so weak that it took me an age to even get the lid off, and then I spilt more than I managed to gulp down. I sat there shaking and then vomited up the water that I had just drunk. After this, I took small sips and eventually I opened one of the cans and I ate some fruit. That gave me stomach cramps and made me feel utterly exhausted, so I lay down and drifted into a fitful sleep. The time that followed saw me falling into a kind of routine. I would wake up and lie there as still as I could, listening for the sound of the changed or the military. When I was as convinced as I could be that the silence meant that there was no one there, I would sip water, open a new can, and eat a small portion of the food that it held. Then I would use the toilet. Every time the smell of the toilet itself made me want to puke again, but I fought to keep the food and water down. I was disoriented and scared, but I was still trying to survive. I can't say how many days and nights passed like this, but I knew a point would come where these supplies would run out and I would be forced to leave. I decided not to wait. I stood on the chair and started to push the floorboard open. There was a loud creak and I lost my nerve. I ended up crouched in a corner as waves of fear passed through me. After more long and lonely hours, I tried again. This time I made it out of the bunker. The floorboards were stained with dried blood, but the bodies of the changed were gone. The military must have removed them. Desperately hoping that the military had left themselves after doing this, I made my way through the house. The armchair where James had made his last stand was still there. Its fabric was stained with dried blood. I said thank you to the memory of the brave old soldier who had saved my life, and I stepped outside. The daylight hurt my eyes. I raised my hand to shield myself for a few moments, and then I tentatively lowered it and crossed the disheveled grounds of the house. I walked along the alley and emerged onto the street, where I had witnessed the helicopter mow down the changed. The road was empty and the houses that lined it all looked the same. I thought of Sarah, of the thing that she had become. I figured its body had been taken along with all the rest of them. I didn't want to think what might have happened to it as the authorities covered up what had happened here. I didn't want to think of my parents either. That was more than I could bear. I clenched my hands and I walked on. There was no sign of life anywhere that I went, and it was eerily quiet. There were no sounds of traffic, no music drifting from open windows or dogs barking. There wasn't even any bird song. My hometown was deserted apart from me. I assumed that it had been sealed off by the authorities and more lies about chemical spills had been fed to the media. And if I tried to leave, I would be killed and my body would be removed. Well, for now, I seemed to have slipped under the radar, and I was not going to do anything to change that. I raised a finger to the powers that be, and I walked on. I went home. It was silent inside and empty. I went through to the front room, and I slumped onto the sofa. The remote was still on the table. I picked it up and tried to turn on the TV, but nothing happened. I leaned over and tried to turn a lamp on, but again there was nothing. The power was off. Of course it was, I thought, and I laughed sadly to myself. Then, as I had done so many times before, the change came. I went through the kitchen to see if there was anything left to eat. I didn't know how long the power had been out for, so I opened up the fridge to check it. The smell of spoiled food told me that the power had been off for quite a while. I tried the freezer anyway and found beef burgers that had gone rotten. There would be cans in the cupboards that I could open and live off for a while, though, I knew. But I would have so loved a burger with fried onions and fries on the side. I sighed and turned away, and I heard a noise that I had heard before and hoped that I would never hear it again. I had heard a snarl. It was one of them. One of the changed. It was in the hallway outside the kitchen. It snarled again and shuffled into the room. I felt sick to the core when I saw it. It had been my dad once, this thing. Dried blood covered one side of its face where it had been banging its head against the glass in the car in mindless frustration and not being able to release the seatbelt. Well, it had clearly freed itself and then somehow escaped the notice of the military. And now it was coming closer. Its eyes were glazed over and drool bubbled in the corners of its mouth as its hunger built. I looked around. There were kitchen knives lined up in a holder on one of the work surfaces. I was quicker than it was, and if I could drive one of the knives into its eye, then that could be the end of it. But it had been my dad. I didn't want to hurt it, and maybe I would not have to. I grabbed a handful of rotten burgers and threw them onto the floor at its feet. It paused, reached down, and began to devour the rancid meat. When it was finished, it looked up at me and growled a single word at me. More. I emptied the freezer of the rotting burgers and threw them over. There was a side of ham as well, and I threw that also. The ham had turned a while ago, and it was infested with bugs. That didn't bother the thing that had been my dad, though. It gorged on the burgers and the ham and then looked at me and growled, More. That was 3 days ago. Since then, I've gone from house to house and from freezer to freezer with the thing that had been my dad trailing after me and feeding on the rotten meat that we find. I've started to take a little bit of the rancid meat for myself as well. The taste isn't as bad as I thought it would be. And I can't see what I'm putting in my mouth that clearly anymore. I can just about make out the key on my phone to press it to end this recording. I'll leave my phone somewhere in the hope that it'll be found and one day the truth about my hometown can be told. As for myself, I don't think that I'll ever leave my hometown. I'll just keep on shuffling down the road.